Good afternoon, everybody. Certainly appreciate you joining our webinar today entitled Workflow in BC. We're going to give it about another minute to let a few other people join. We've got a big group today, so I want to give everybody the ability to join from the beginning. So give it about another minute and we'll get started. All right, well, it looks like it's about a minute after the hour, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Certainly, again, thank everybody for taking the time out of their busy day to join us. My name is Mark Munson with Ace Micro, and we're going to be discussing workflow in Business Central today. So I've got a couple slides that I'll be going through to set the stage, and then we'll get directly into Business Central and kind of show you how workflow operates. So got a lot of good content for you today. But let me get through some of these slides and we'll get into that content and show you a little bit more. So let me advance my slide here. So a couple housekeeping items. First of all attendees have been muted. We'll probably unmute at the end of the session, maybe somewhere in the middle in case there's some questions that we need to address live. But for right now, everybody's muted just to kind of keep the background noise down. This session will be recorded. If you'd like a copy of the recording, let me know, shoot me a quick email. And either sometime later this afternoon or early tomorrow morning, the recording will be available and I'll send you a copy of that. If you have questions during the presentation, if you can enter those questions in the chat box within GoToWebinar, I'll be behind the scenes while Chris is presenting, trying to address those. If not, we'll pause and either address them midway through the presentation or at the end. Again, the recording is available, just let me know. And then for those that are attending, if there's desires to start getting some of the free assessments that we're offering for our GP clients, to start looking at Business Central. So whether it's an assessment on what the migration would look like, whether it's a data migration assessment, what your data in GP looks like as compared to the state it needs to be in to migrate to Business Central, let me know on that as well and we can get that coordinated. So let's go ahead and let's start. And I'm going to start with a couple questions. And if you can just kind of enter your responses into the chat box, I would certainly appreciate it. So the first question, and you can answer these all in one chat response or separately, it's up to you, but do you currently use workflow within your current organization? So that's the first question. So if you can start responding back to that. The next question is the workflow that you're currently using native to GP? So is it GP workflow that you've configured within the system or maybe we configured for you? Or is it a third-party app? So maybe like an AP workflow solution like a QuickTag or maybe a PaperSave or something like that. So is it native workflow? Is it third-party app? And if it's a third-party app, what app are you using? And then lastly, what's the primary workflows of your organization? What are the workflows that are most important to you? So you have the whole AP approval process, could be an example of one. You might have a vendor management, so when you add vendors, there's an approval process that has to take place to approve that vendor can be added. So give me some insight on what those workflows look like within your organization. All right, I'm just waiting for some responses here. All right, interesting. And I'll share those a little bit further as we get further into the to the presentation today. So let's see, what do we have? A lot of no's. So no workflow, no workflow, some workflow, and GP. Really don't have one other than the manager's code, the invoices, and bring them downstairs. or email them. So I call that the sneaker net workflow there, where you're manually walking invoices around. Not in regard to BC. So yeah, not seeing a lot of workflow here. So I think this will be interesting for a lot of folks, because this will just show you some of the power that's available within Business Central when it comes to these workflow activities, and letting the system do a lot of the, the mundane effort of circulating, some sort of document throughout the organization to seek those approvals that we all need as part of, our day-to-day business. So let me move on then. All right, so workflow. What exactly is workflow? So a common definition of it is the sequence of tasks or events that are triggered by an action or a condition or a rule. So it's, in a lot of cases, think of it as that, the old if-then statement. If this happens, then this must happen. So you usually integrate business logic into your organization. So again, if you're designing a workflow, understand that there has to be logic behind it. When I talk about this if-then statement, there needs to be strong definition. It can't be, it can't be so variable and so subjective that you can't automate it. There needs to be some thought and business logic behind it. And you also need to understand who's involved in the workflow. But bottom line is, we're just institutionalizing best practices in these situations, and we're using the system and we're configuring the system to do those types of things for us. So workflow is pretty straightforward. We're going to get into it a little bit further. Again, many of you may do this. Many of you may do this in an automated fashion. Many of you may do it, just via email. But I think we're going to show you kind of a better approach to all that. So let's move forward. And approval workflows. So there's a couple different kinds of workflows. Approval workflows are just like what it sounds like. I have something I needed approved by either one or many people. So you can see that little diagram where the workflow is triggered. And in this situation, I've got multiple approvers here. I could have just a single approval level. In this case, I've got multiple approvers. It could be approver one is able to approve anything under, $10,000. If it's over $10,000, maybe it needs to go to another person at $50,000. If it's and this is maybe like a PO or an invoice. If it's over $100,000, it needs to go to a third level approval. So there's just basically the logic of what needs to be approved and who are the approvers based on what conditions. So we're able to create these workflows again based on what causes it to start, and then what happens next. And we're able to define these workflow steps by basically going into these templates that are there and available to us within Business Central to define, again, those actions and those people that are involved in those scenarios. Typical examples might be sales orders. Okay, so in the sales organization, maybe all sales orders need to be approved before they're processed. Maybe this sales order needs to be approved because there's some special discounting that's going on, or the margins don't quite meet what our norms are. So sales orders is a good example. Purchase orders, again, any kind of purchasing activity and the appropriate approval on that purchasing, on that purchase, maybe by the department head who's asking for that purchase to be made. Quotes, invoices. If you're doing any kind of updates within the system, so maybe price changes. I talked about adding vendors or customer edits. So any of these types of things can be defined, and we can set up in a workflow to make the entire process a lot easier. So and those are native workflows within Business Central. So there are certain things that just natively within Business Central you can automate and provide a workflow behind. If we start getting beyond Business Central and maybe into more complex workflows, you have a tool called Power Automate, which is part of what Microsoft calls the Power Platform. So many of you may have heard of Power BI. Power Automate is kind of the workflow engine associated with the Power Platform, and Power BI is kind of the reporting and data visualization tool. But Power Automate is a tool that we can use. You have licensing for it within Business Central, and it allows you to develop these workflows. And if you're doing Power Automate workflows, you can do much, much more complex workflows than you could potentially do natively within Business Central. You can also, and the big key differentiator here, is those workflows can be either internal or external sources. So I can do a workflow on data that's within BC. I can start doing workflows that maybe incorporate data from other systems and disparate sources. So now you can imagine you can get more complex when you have to start referring to disparate data sources and bringing that onto a workflow. And Power Automate allows you to do that in a fairly simple and straightforward fashion. So those are, again, we're going to talk about native BC workflows, and then we're going to show you some more complex ones that are going to leverage Power Automate. And so you have to just kind of really look at the type of workflow you need, where the data is that you need to share to route it through whatever that workflow you defined is. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Chris. Chris is the Director of Cloud Solutions here at Ace Micro. 20 plus years of experience in the Dynamics space. Started off doing a lot of work in Dynamics GP, and then really within the last 5 years has personally started to make the journey into Business Central. And he leads up a lot of our efforts in the Business Central area in building our team, building our solution set, building our deployment methodology, training, those types of things. So Chris, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you kind of dive in. And I'll be behind the scenes just answering questions. And if the questions build up too much, then we'll take a pause, open it up for some verbal questions and go from there. So again, thanks for joining. Chris, it's all yours, sir.
All right, thank you. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are today. I appreciate you joining us. Let me just get my...
And Chris, I just made you presenter, sir.
Okay. Let's just make sure you should be seeing Outlook. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, good. Okay, so I'm going to start just in some slides here really quick. I won't be in the slides very long, but I think it's really important to just talk about some of the templates that are available inside Business Central and Power Automate, things that you can deploy on day one of your Business Central deployment. So just to sort of start, the out-of-the-box workflow templates, there's several different types, and mostly where people start is in master records, and master records are kind of what we see under the cards menu in Dynamics GP. So, typically what we see is when you set up a new customer or a new vendor or a new inventory item, some people want to put a workflow where we can do an approval before that master record, whichever one it may be, can be transacted upon. So, meaning when we set up a new customer, when an AR clerk goes in, sets up a new customer, they may want to get an approval from the assigned salesperson before anything else can be done with that customer record. Or perhaps it has to go to the AR manager, or perhaps pricing needs to be checked with, with the product team. Those are all kind of workflows that are driven around a customer setup. And you can kind of use your imagination to see some of the same sort of workflows that you may see on a vendor or on a inventory item. We have a lot of clients that do manufacturing, and if you're in the distribution and the manufacturing space, the most tedious setup in terms of master records is an inventory item. There's just so many different areas of it, and this is a really good item to utilize workflow on. You can also utilize workflow for documents, and these are basically documents that are printed. So think of like your sales quotes, your sales orders, your purchase orders. If you recall from one of our earlier sessions, purchase invoices in BC is sort of like two windows in Dynamics GP. It's the payables transaction entry, which is typically used for vouchers, as well as that purchase invoice that you may use for matching. So that purchase invoice document inside Business Central kind of takes the place of both of those entry points inside Dynamics GP. So that's something that we see a lot of, as well as credit memos on both sides of the fence. So if we have credit memos that are going to start on the AR side related to a customer, we can hook those into a workflow. And likewise on the payable side, we can hook those credit memos into a workflow and get approvals and so forth. And just before I get too far away from master records, customers, vendors, and items, I talked about creation of those records and having the trigger based on when a new customer is created. That trigger can also be when a customer is modified. So if there is a change to a customer, or if there is a change to a vendor or an item, that can also trigger a workflow that may or may not have an approval associated with it as well. So new as well as edits. Also, there's this concept of journals inside Business Central. You know, our select checks process in payables, that is actually what's called a payment journal inside Business Central. It's very similar to the select checks process, but technically it's not a document, it's a journal. So those journals, which are very batch driven, just like in Dynamics GP, those batches can be hooked into workflows and can be utilized to either send notifications or get approvals. And then lastly, out of the box, you get a couple of specialty workflows. And I call these specialty because they're kind of hooked into a particular field or a particular business scenario. And those are a customer credit limit change. So a customer may be set up, may have a $10,000 credit limit for 3 months, and then someone goes in and makes a change and ups the credit limit to $20,000. Well, that's not a new customer, but once that field changes, that can trigger either a notification or an approval request that goes to either the salesperson or the sales manager. And we'll talk a little bit about routing here in just a minute. As well as item price list changes. Price lists are very similar as they are in Dynamics GP. The terminology is a little different, but the nuts and bolts are the same. So if you ever make changes to those price list lines, you know, whether they're quantity breaks or changes in the percentages of list price, you know, those sort of things, those can trigger approval workflows as well. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the basic features. So first and foremost, anyone that's tried to implement workflow inside Dynamics GP knows that getting it hooked into email was always very difficult in terms of what you needed to have on-prem with Exchange and web services and all of that. So workflow using Power Automate, out of the box, you get email-based approvals, and I'm gonna show you that in an example here in just a moment. In addition to email-based approvals, we also have apps that can be installed on our devices, and a device can be an iPhone, it can be an Android phone, it can be an iPad or an Android-based device or tablet. So based on what type of workflow you're using, all of those devices have apps, either a Power Automate app or a Business Central app where you can interact with the workflows. So if you're not on your, in your email all day, you can have push notifications, directly to the desktop of your app, and you can interact with them directly from your device. This works really well with salespeople that are often on the road. We also have different approval types. So we've got 4 basic types of approvals. So every user can have what's called a direct approver assigned to them. So if I'm Greg, I can have Amy as always my direct approver for sales transactions. I can also have a workflow group. So maybe Amy has 3 other employees that also have rights to approve for Greg. I could put all 4 of those people in what's called a workflow group, Amy and her the 3 employees that are at her level in the approval chain, and I can just have Greg assigned to this workflow group in terms of approval. So anyone in that group can approve the workflow request. I can also make it dynamic on the document or the customer or vendor itself. So I gave you the example of like a salesperson needs to approve a credit limit change. Well, that salesperson will reside on the customer card, or that purchasing agent will reside on the vendor card. So workflow can automatically or dynamically grab that information from the master record card itself and then route the approval accordingly based on what's on the card. And then lastly, the approval type of custom is really like, it's who you make it, right? Who you want it to be, and it's very unique to the workflow itself. You know, I'm going to show you a workflow here in a minute where, you know, purchase orders that are entered over $10,000 always get routed to Amy. So that would be a custom approval type because Amy's not a purchaser, she's not a direct approver, she is the catch-all for any purchase order over $10,000. So that's what I mean by custom. You don't have to set up a direct approver relationship. You can just embed it directly in the approval chain. Delegates and reassignments. We can also set up delegates and reassign approvals to someone else. So if I'm Amy and I get a approval request from someone, I can have a delegate assigned to me so that if I'm out of the office, I can go ahead and someone else can work on my behalf and do my approvals for me. And then lastly, we have approval thresholds by user. So we'll have you know, specific amounts if we want to set these up, and I'll show you the setup window for this once we get into the product. But we can set up certain approval amounts for purchasing documents and sales documents that are assigned to those approval users. So I could have Joe can approve up to $10,000, but Diane needs to approve anything over $10,000. So the approval chain can be dynamic based on those different thresholds, and we only need to set it up once at the approval user level. And then all of our approvals have due dates on them, or I should say they can have due dates on them. And this is very helpful because when you open up workflow to a lot of areas of the system, I'm going to show you when we get into the product, we are restricting a lot of records based on those workflows not being completed. So those restrictions will also have due dates, and people can be notified when people aren't taking action on approvals. So I'll talk a little bit more about that when we go in and do an example, but every single approval request, just know, can have a due date on it, and you can have escalations and so forth set up in the system to make sure that those approvals don't just sit out there in perpetuity and never get approved, and now you know, nothing happens because we can't act on a specific document. Before I go any further on any of the features and anything, Mark, are there any questions that you want me to answer that have come in?
No questions so far. So I said we just kind of dive into the solution and go
Okay.
from there.
All right, so let's just walk through this basic. I'm going to give you two different workflows in this demo. This is an extremely hard demo to do because there's a lot of moving parts, and I want to do it quick so that you see the timing and so forth. So basically, I've got two basic workflow users here. I have Amy and Greg. I have Amy, who's a purchasing manager, and then I have Greg, who is the AP clerk. And if you look at Greg's line down there at the bottom, Greg is going to set up a new vendor, and that new vendor is going to require an approval request that goes to Amy before any transactions can be put on that new vendor. Okay, so that's kind of going to be workflow number one, and we're going to see that all the way through. So once that's approved and that vendor does get set up, then Greg's going to take the next step, and he's going to do a purchase order for that vendor. And in this scenario, this purchase order, Greg has the approval to put anything in under $10,000, but any purchase order that has a document total of greater than $10,000 does require Amy's approval on it. So Greg will need to get that second one approved as well. Okay, so we got two workflows that we're going to do here, and I'm going to try to call this out as much as I can in terms of who I'm impersonating, either Greg or Amy. So we are going to start the process with Greg, and I'm going to go to Greg's Outlook right here. You can see inside Outlook, and he has Business Central here as well. So Greg is going to set up a new vendor, and I'm going to go ahead and go to his Role Center homepage, and I'll go up here to the right so you can see this is actually Greg, and I will go into vendors, and we're going to set up a new vendor for a print shop because we're a publication company here. And I'm going to create one from a template. This is a vendor company. This is much like the class inside Dynamics GP. So I'm going to say vendor company. It's going to give me my new vendor ID, and I'm going to set up Turbo Printing Services here. And I'm just going to put a quick address in here. We'll just say this is John Smith, and I'm going to put my email address in here. Okay, so I've got some basic information here for the vendor. I've got an address, I've got a vendor name. It's actually vendor 120 for Turbo Printing Services. And you'll notice up here in the sub menu, I've got this request approval right here. And I'm going to go ahead and send this approval request right up here in the upper left. And you'll notice that in a lot of the windows, and I may have showed you this in some of the other demos that we've done, all of the windows are very, very similar. So this request approval dialog that's up here in the upper left, it's there on all of the documents that I showed you those workflow templates for. So whether it's a customer, a vendor, an item, or one of those documents, you're always going to see this request approval up here at the top. It's always going to be in the same place. And you'll notice that once I send that approval request, it's grayed out. And then I have a cancel approval request over here is really the only action that I can do as the requester. Okay. Now, a couple things that, yep,
Chris,
go ahead, Mark.
So this document's locked at this point when you've sent that approval request?
Exactly. So once the approval request is sent, and that's a good question. There's this concept of what's called restricted records. Okay, and these restricted records are those records that are locked based on a workflow. So if I go into my restricted records list, I, as a workflow administrator or anyone that has access to this list, I can see all of those vendors, all of those documents that have a particular lock associated with them. So whether they're vendors, customers, sales orders, sales quotes, I can always see that. And you notice that this restriction was imposed by this workflow ID over here.
All right, perfect. Thank you.
Yep. Now I could not enter any other information or any other documents for this vendor until that is lifted because it is a restricted document. Now I'm doing this very, very easily with Amy, but you'll notice that I've got a purchaser code right here. If you remember from my approval types in the slides that I just did, if I assigned this to a particular approver, I could make this a dynamic approval so that it gets routed to the purchaser code as opposed to routed directly to Amy. In this scenario, this is being routed directly to Amy. All right, so I'm going to go switch hats here, and I'm going to go into Amy. And this is one of the problems with a live demo is the timing in my test environment takes a couple of minutes, and Amy has not gotten her email yet. But if you look in the upper right-hand corner, you can see this is Amy's email right here. So what I'm going to do while we're waiting for this email, I'm going to jump back into Business Central. And I'm going to show you the approval setup just while we're waiting for this to, waiting for that email to hit Amy's inbox. So I showed you, I talked about the different approval types, but we have this concept inside Business Central called approval users. And the approval users, this is anyone that's going to interact with a workflow. So think of it as someone who's going to either request approval or someone who's going to give approval. And in my example, I have an admin here, I have Amy, and I have Greg. So I have 3 different people that I have set up in my test environment here, and they all have their email addresses. But this is the window that I would go into in order to set up all of those relationships and all of those static approval limits that I could use in many workflows. So if I wanted to map Amy to a particular purchaser code so that Amy could be used in an approval type of purchaser, this is where I would do that. If I wanted to set up a direct approval relationship for Greg, and I want Amy to approve all of Greg's workflows, this is where I would set that up. Then I also have the ability to set up those static limits. So sales amount approval limit, purchase amount approval limit. I can set those up here. So if Greg can only do quotes and orders up to $10,000 without approval, I could put that static value in here. Same thing on the purchasing side as well. And then lastly, if I have substitutions, right? If I have someone that substitutes in for Greg when Greg's, or for Amy when Amy's on vacation, I want the admin to be able to go in and review and approve based on Amy's behalf. We have any questions on any of that, Mark?
No questions yet, Chris.
Okay. All right, so let me go back to Amy's email here. This has been...
Well, I take that back. Actually, Chris, there is a question here.
Okay.
So if Amy takes like 3 days to approve, will Greg see a status of the approval somewhere, like in progress or pending? And I think you're going to touch on that a little bit later in the demonstration, if I understand correctly. But
yeah, there will be an association inside Power Automate, and I will show you that once we do the purchase order. I'll show you. Amy will do an approval inside Power Automate, and we'll be able to see all of those requests that are outstanding.
So Tony, we'll show you that just shortly.
All right. Let's jump right back here, and Amy's email has still not come in. This is now over 5 minutes. So I'm going to jump ahead, and I am going to show you how we can approve this inside our Power Automate app, just because we're not getting our email here for some reason. So Amy has the ability either inside a browser or on her phone to interact with all of her approvals. And that's with a product called Power Automate and an app called Power Automate that can be on her, either on her phone, or she can interact in her browser. So there's an approvals dialog here, which you'll notice that if I click on approvals, this is where I can see all of my approvals that have been received, sent, or that I've already acted upon. So if that was Tony that asked that question, this is actually where you would go to see all of the approvals that you sent, all of the approvals that you've received, and anything that's outstanding. And then, of course, anything that you've acted on will be in the history over here as well. So you'll notice it's 9:34 my time. So this was sent at 9:27 here. I can click on it, and I can see inside my approval request, I can see I've got a request from Greg Winston. The time is here, and the details of the request are vendor 120 Turbo Printing Services needs to be approved before it can be edited or used in association with any documents. So I have the ability right here, either on my phone or in the browser, to interact with this workflow. So I'm going to go ahead and approve this workflow. I know Turbo Printing Services. If I wanted to go view the record, I could click on the link right here, and I'll show you that on the purchasing side. And I don't know if anybody heard that ding right there, but that is the email that finally hit for Amy. There it is. So this is Amy's email right here. You can see it's very similar to the request that I was just acting upon inside Power Automate. Let me get Amy's picture up here so you know I'm in Amy's inbox. So it gives me all the same information. says Turbo Printing Services needs to be approved before it can be edited. If I wanted to view the vendor, I certainly could right here. And what's nice is I can approve this directly from my email. Okay, so I can go right into approve. I can write a comment. Looks great, Greg. Please issue the purchase order ASAP. And I can go ahead and click on submit. So this comment will always be on the approval, and you'll notice I'm still in this email right here. I haven't switched or anything. The email is still up, right? But notice how it shows me that I've already acted upon this in my email. So the status of this is actually approved, and then the comment you can see that I wrote is in the email now. So this web part kind of gets updated and shows me that I've already acted upon this request. I don't need to do anything further. Okay, so again, I'm Amy right now. I'm going to switch hats. I'm going to go back to Greg. Okay, if you notice, here's Greg's picture. I'm now back to Greg's desk. If I go into Greg's email here, notice that he just got an email 1 minute ago that's telling me that Amy Alberts has approved vendor V00120 for Turbo Printing Services, and it's ready to go. And there's my comment that Amy made right there. So please issue the purchase order ASAP. I'm going to listen to her. She is my boss, so I'm going to do that quickly here. Before I do, I just want to show you the restricted records again, because now that that's been approved, notice that that is not a restricted record anymore. I have nothing in my restricted records, so that vendor can now be, can have a transaction entered on it. So I am Greg here. I'm going to listen to Amy and go ahead and issue that purchase order. So I have a new purchase order here that is going to be for Turbo Printing Services. I'm just going to very quickly enter a GL account here for miscellaneous expenses here. And this is printing services for the July issue. Okay, and I'm gonna enter this the first time just so you see the workflow filter here. I'm gonna enter this for $9,995. Okay, that's under my $10,000 threshold that's set on Greg here. So if I do this, this is much like GP. The status of this purchase order is open right now, and I need to release it before I can print it or interact with it any further. So if I'm under my threshold and I go ahead and release it, notice how the status changes to released. There's no workflow that's needed because my threshold is $10,000. Now, in order for me to make any changes to this, just like in GP, I have to reopen this purchase order. So I'm going to reopen it, and I'm going to modify this to over my limit, $10,050, and I'm going to try to release that again. And notice what happens. The document can only be released when the approval process is complete, because I'm over my threshold amount. So just like I did on the vendor side, I need to request approval from this, and I'm going to send an approval request. And notice that now the status of this document changed from open, and it went to pending approval. All right, so now we can switch hats. I've done what Amy asked me to do. I entered my purchase order. I can see in my purchase order list that my purchase order for Turbo Printing Services for $10,050 is pending approval. I'm going to put my Amy hat back on here, and her email is very slow. So I am going to go into Power Automate and show you exactly what I was going to show you a second ago. And I'm going to go to my approvals and notice that I have an approval request. If I look in my history, I should see that vendor approval request that I did here. I just did this at 9:35, 4 minutes ago on the vendor. That's already in history. I have a full history of everything that I've approved. But if I want to see the ones that are outstanding, I'm going to go to received, and here's that new purchase order that Greg just sent me 1 minute ago. I can click on it. I get the details. It gives me the purchase order. It gives me my amount. All of this is customizable. You can put as much detail in the actual message as you want. You can pull dynamic fields directly from the purchase order header and put them in the message here. I'm going to click on View Purchase Orders here really quick in the link, and that's going to take me right back into Business Central so that I can review that purchase order and just make sure that it's going to the correct account before I approve it. So there it is. Yep, it's going to 61,500. That looks great to me. Amy's going to go ahead and approve this. So I'm back in Power Automate. I can go ahead and click on Approve. Looks good. Please send to vendor. And I will go ahead and confirm. And notice that it says successfully recorded. It's now moved from received to history. Amy's work is done for the day. She's going home. Now if I switch my hats and I go back to Greg here, let's go in his email first, because you did, I don't know if you heard that ding in the background, but Greg's email is much faster than Amy's apparently. But I'm going to go ahead and go into this email that I just got sent. Amy Alberts has approved purchase order 106012. The comment shows in the email right there. It looks good. Please send to vendor. So I can now go back in here and I'm just going to refresh my list. Keep an eye on this field right here. It goes from pending approval to released. So if I open up that purchase order there, my purchase order has changed from pending approval to now released, and I can go ahead and move on and send this out to my vendor. I will go ahead and send that. I'm going to send that via email. All right, and I was the email recipient from Turbo Printing Services there. So that's the basic workflow. This is going to show me a copy of the email that it's going to send before I click send on it. But that is the entire workflow from end to end. So just showed you how to set up a new vendor, how to, after that vendor is set up and approved, how to create a purchase order and walk through. I didn't cover this status really well. On all of our documents, we always have a status, and open and released is kind of used everywhere inside Business Central from a document workflow perspective. So I know we use released in purchase order in Dynamics GP. It's very similar inside Business Central. Now the intermediary step between an open document and a released document is commonly pending approval, and that's for the approval process. So as you start on your Business Central journey, like those statuses will kind of come second nature to you, whether you're on the sales order side or the purchase orders side, and they're specifically there for workflow and so forth. All right, so that is my basic demo. One thing that, before I hand it over to you, Mark, the one thing that I wanted to mention is, you know, we focused a lot on approvals and workflows that require someone to physically review and approve something before it can move forward in the process. You know, that's not always what is needed in an organization. Sometimes we need workflow for just reminders or general notifications. I know 10, 15 years ago, we used to use business alerts inside Dynamics GP, if anybody knows business alerts. You know, business alerts was really cool because you could set up a trigger that said, when a document is more than 31 days old, send the salesperson an email, you know, just notifying them. That's something that we can do with Power Automate, and it doesn't require an approval. It's just for specific notifications for business events. And that's kind of an added benefit that you get with the workflow engine inside BC, is you can set up those generic notifications for certain events. One that we commonly see on the vendor side is that, you know, when we set up a vendor, and I'll just go really quick, when we set up this Turbo Printing Services, if this is a 1099 vendor, sometimes we'd like somebody to know so that they can go track down a W-9 whenever we specify someone as a non-employee compensation. So if we ever create a vendor and we set the 1099 code or the box code to NEC01, we may want someone to get emailed that says, hey, this new vendor just got set up. It got designated as NEC01. Hey, make sure you go and get them to fill out the proper paperwork and associate it with the vendor. Those are different kind of things that we can use for workflows that don't necessarily require an approval, but it's just a notification and sort of advances a certain business process that you have. Mark, are there any other questions before I hand it back over to you?
Yeah, we got a couple questions here, so I think you and I can tag team them pretty easily. Okay. And then I'll take control of the screen and finish out the presentation for today. So one question coming in, Power Automate is part of the out-of-the-box BC workflow or an addition? So I'll touch on that a little bit. Power Automate is actually a separate tool, okay? But you're licensed with it with Business Central, and you can leverage that, but it's not a tool that's specific to BC by any means, but it's a tool that you can certainly leverage, and Chris has shown you how to do that. Chris, do you want to add to that or clarify my response? Yeah, so you basically get unrestricted use of Power Automate for Business Central purposes as part of your Business Central license. So everything that I showed you today is free out of the box, part of your Business Central license with Power Automate. Now, if you were going to check a salesperson from CRM, let's say, which is another product, or you wanted to go and check another system like Shopify or an EDI product and use that in the workflow, that would be an additional connector, and you would need a Power Automate license in order to facilitate that connection. But as long as you're staying in the Business Central and Outlook and Power Automate ecosystem, the license is included with BC. All right, perfect, thanks. Next question here. Can the approval relationship be one-to-many? I think we covered this, but maybe not clearly enough. You just have multiple entries in the approval user setup table to accomplish. I think this is where you talked about group approvals, Chris. Yep. You can do group approvals so that if you have 3 people that are eligible to approve a request, any one of the 3 that approves it basically approves the request, and it removes that open request from the others. You can also have stepped approvals if it has to go through Amy and then it has to go through Chuck, let's say. If it's over 50,000, then you can have a stepped approval process also. Right. And then you can have substitute approvals or delegated approvals, I think is the right terminology, that if you're out for whatever reason, vacation, PTO, whatever the case may be, that person has delegated authority to approve on your behalf, correct? Correct. All right, fantastic. I think that is all the questions for right now. So let me close the question box down. Let me take presentation again. Okay, show my screen. All right, Chris, can you see my screen now? Yes, I can. All right, perfect. All right, so Chris, great job. Thank you so much for walking us through that. A couple of pretty straightforward approval processes that we went through today that most organizations have in place. Again, whether that's an automated process, a manual process, it's still a process, and you can see the ease of which we can automate those and the ease of which people can approve them, whether it's an email, whether it's on their phone, whether it's in a tablet. Leveraging that Power Automate to be able to access that and approve that, from wherever you are, whatever time, it makes life a lot easier. Chris, one question just for the crowd to clarify: the approvers, do they have to be licensed for BC or no? No, they don't have to be licensed for BC
in order to approve via email, like I just showed you.
Right. So that's one of the benefits too, is if you have people outside of accounting that don't necessarily need to have day in and day out access to BC, they can certainly be involved in these workflows, and they don't need to be licensed in Business Central to take on these activities. So that's another thing that's very, very nice about it. All right, so we're going to wrap things up here. Let me move to the next slide. So this is the fifth session of 5 that we've conducted over the last 5 months. And the whole goal that we had here at ACE was to really go through session by session and provide a little bit more deeper dive into Business Central to answer questions people may have that are currently in GP and contemplating going to Business Central. So we did 5 of those sessions. Today's the 5th. If you attended all 5 of them, kudos to you. Thank you so much. If not, those sessions are out there and available via recording, so just request them, and happy to send them if you missed any of the prior sessions. But we did quite a bit. Didn't mean to advance. So our first session was talking about when's the best time to move from GP to BC. Then we did an intro to BC for the GP user, where we kind of compared and contrast what the experience is like. Then we talked about reporting in BC. And what are your options? Because in GP it's management reporter. Management reporter goes away because that's GP specific. What are your options in Business Central when it comes to reporting? We talked about data, and what about my data if I'm making that migration, and what are the things I need to think about before any migration that I need to do as far as any kind of data cleansing work. And today we covered workflow. So the question I'm going to pose to the crowd is, the thought that we had when we first came up with this series of educational webinars was to kind of rinse and repeat. So next month, we were thinking about starting over for those of you that did not see it live and kind of repeating through these 5 sessions again. So that's one thought that we have out there. The other thought is maybe getting a client next month on the phone that has made the move to Business Central and can talk through the business reasons why they made the decision to move to Business Central, the technical challenges that maybe they had, and how we overcame them. So what I was hoping to do is get some feedback from the group here today as to what type of session would you prefer to see next month. Start to repeat these sessions again in case you haven't seen them, or maybe get a couple clients that can jump on a call with us. We do a kind of a sit down question and answer session and talk to them about some of their thoughts as they went through this process. So if you're in the question section, if you can just kind of type in a response, that would certainly help us. I'll look for those here in a second. And then we'll be announcing probably in the next couple of weeks what the next session will look like. Chris, it looks like we have a couple of other questions coming in. Can you create an approval for, this is a good question, can you create an approval for GL account ads?
I'm not sure about that. I don't think there's a template out of the box for GL account ads, but you could create one manually. So there's no template, but you could create a specific workflow for it. Okay. So it's doable, but there's no out of the box template for it.
Right. So it's not core to BC per se, but something we could potentially do in Power Automate.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. All right. Fantastic. And it looks like from early feedback, it looks like the testimonial is kind of the direction that most people are going, and kind of the direction that I'd like to go as well. I think it'd be nice to talk to and hear from somebody who's been through this process. So we'll take that into consideration on our end, try to make the appropriate plans, check on client availability, and then we'll announce that for the March webinar series. Beyond that, if there's any other questions, I don't see any other questions. So again, thank you for your time today. We certainly do appreciate it. We know how valuable your time is, and we truly do appreciate you taking the time to spend with us. Let me know if you need a copy of the recording. I'll let you know what the next webinar looks like and when. Plan on seeing something in the next week or 2 on that. And beyond that, everybody have a great afternoon, and we'll talk soon.